All right, so it looks like we have sort of 30 people signed in. In the sake of time, I'd like to go ahead and get started. Understand that there'll be people coming and going. Please do what you need to do. It's wonderful when you have the camera on because then able to sort of see you, at least the people who are sort of visible on the screen, but definitely sort of feel free to have it off if you need to. I want to sort of welcome you to this session. It's called Native American Pedagogies in Remote Teaching, an Initial Discussion. I'll say a little bit more about the motivation for the title. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the lands on which the UCR is built, and to acknowledge the original, current, and future caretakers of these lands, as the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples. I also want to recognize that I'm not currently at UCR, the campus, rather in my living room, which is also in Riverside, very close to the Santa Ana River, in some place that I would imagine as Cahuilla and Tongva land in particular, right at the confluence there. This event is sponsored by the Reclamation and Native American Communities Faculty Commons at UC Riverside, which I have the pleasure of being the convener for. Many of you are already aware of the Faculty Commons. In fact, many of you are involved in Faculty Commons. This is an initiative from the University of California Office of the President that's aimed primarily sort of building community among groups of faculty with an eye toward retention. I think wisely recognizing that when people are connected to each other, which is something I'm going to talk about today, when people are connected to each other, they want to sort of be in a given place and they also thrive in that place. And so the event is sponsored by the Faculty Commons Group, but as you can see at the bottom of your screen, I hope that you're seeing a title slide here. It's intended to develop and evolve through the participation of all who want to be involved. As some of you already know in terms of the background, the discussion about having some sort of series or some sort of discussion, formal discussion about pedagogies with an eye toward the remote teaching context we're in, it's been developing in my Faculty Commons Group over the summer. I'm at this point quite interested in the possibility of having an entire series with perhaps guest speakers, webinars, perhaps a reading group at times where we'd all sort of look at something and talk about it together. Could be a whole host of things, and also sort of takes advantage of the reality that we're in, just that we're limited, very limited in our ability to physically gather on campus, but we have a lot of things that we can do remotely. And certain types of discussions, especially things like webinars, lend themselves, I think, to the remote context in that they facilitate attendance and participation by a much broader range of people, because you'll just need some sort of a decent internet connection. So what are pedagogies? Well, let me say up front that I'm a linguist training, and I'm a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. I am an associate professor of Native American Studies in the Ethnic Studies Department at UC Riverside, and I'm not an expert in pedagogy. I think some of you are. I'm actually just looking out at the list. Some of you actually are experts in pedagogy as a named concept, as an academic area, but it's something that all of us engage with. So pedagogies are ways of teaching and learning, but they're also the underlying ideas that guide those processes, as well as the specific practices that unfold. That's what I want to talk about today, to recognize that sort of Native American and other indigenous pedagogies are sort of by definition anchored in indigenous traditions of producing, sharing, and being responsible toward knowledge. And so the plan for this session, the first part is for me to give a basic sort of presentation of sorts, not to impose certain ideas, because that's actually very anti-indigenous and highly problematic, but rather to share sort of where I'm coming from with the idea that other people can expand on that, refute that, sort of change it as appropriate. And we're going to hear from a couple of people who have prepared some, have some remarks to say. At that point, assuming that there's time, we'll open the floor for people to share tips, ideas about sort of Native American, indigenous, and decolonial pedagogies, particularly for but not exclusively to the remote teaching context. And finally, around the end of the session, I'd like to spend at least a little bit of time soliciting feedback about what sorts of events might be interesting to do this year. I realize that some of you will have to sign off early, please know that my intent is to do some sort of a follow-up email message, at least to those who are registered, where you can give that feedback, perhaps through a Google survey or something like that. It's also my intent to provide a PDF of the slides and of sort of anything else that can be sent that comes up during our discussion. I titled this Native American. I was going back and forth between that and Indigenous, recognizing that they're interrelated but separate categories. Usually we're sort of Native American as a smaller unit, reference to the Americas, whereas Indigenous, of course, is referring to original peoples globally. This is really about Indigenous pedagogies, but I chose to put Native American in the title because I wanted to put special focus on where we are right now, or at least where we are sort of as a sort of a main remote site. You're recognizing that I think in all Indigenous contexts, there's a special obligation to pay particular attention to the pedagogies, to the epistemologies, and so on of the place where one happens to be. Decolonial, I'll sort of talk about more, I think of as pedagogies that respond to coloniality and the associated power structures. But let me tell you what I think of as pedagogy from my own lens as a Miami person. Since I'm a linguist, I like to look at languages and evidence that comes out of languages. So here's an example. In Miamia, which is the name of my tribal language, also known as Miami, the idea of pedagogy is revealed, I believe, through a series of verbs and nouns that all come off the same root. Nepoa means to learn, nepoam, to teach somebody. Nepondingi is a sample full word that means learning from each other, so it has a reciprocal suffix in it, as it's called. Nepoione gets translated as science, and that's actually from a 1700 or circa 1700 manuscript that's held in the archives. But Nepoione we can also think of as a way of knowing. In particular, what I want to call attention to here is that learning and teaching are basically the same word. What's happening with teaching is that there's what's called a transitivizing suffix, meaning that it's a verb that acts upon something, but it's really the same basic unit that refers to having wisdom, that refers to knowledge in a broader sense. And of course, this actually exists a little bit in certain dialects of English, unfortunately in dialects that happen to be stigmatized, because I think they actually have the idea right, which is that the verb learn can mean both learn and teach. I'm going to learn somebody something. And certainly I think it's understood across varieties of English. I want to share some themes of Indigenous pedagogies that have guided my work. One, and fundamentally, is the notion that knowledge is co-produced, and so knowledge is a verb or functions like a verb. We can contrast that to the notion of knowledge as something that's acquired, which is a very sort of colonial model of knowledge. Something is acquired and then sort of disseminated in a particular way and also owned in a sort of a universal sense, as captured in many cases by the phrase our knowledge in academic disciplines. By extension, since knowledge is co-produced and knowledge as a verb, by extension from knowledge being a verb is the notion of experiential knowledge as having special relevance. This is captured among other places by Tanana Athabascan scholar Diane Millian, who has a framework called felt theory, felt, F-E-L-T, as in the past tense of feel. At its core, felt theory asserts that the validity of knowledge that emerges from experiences that are felt, from experiences that are experienced. Okay. Very strong in the notion of Indigenous pedagogies is a focus on particular places and contexts. Indigenous pedagogies connect learning to a specific place. By extension then, a lot of place-based learning, land-based pedagogies, the recognition that land can be a participant or an interlocutor even. And that's different, I think, from most sort of Western ideas where there's a recognition that something is happening on land. And of course, there's going to be some influence from the particular landscape. But the notion that land is a participant is, I think, very, very native. That land is sort of guiding you in how you go about experiencing things, and by extension, by the knowledge that gets co-produced. I'll also make a note here that there's this term remote in the title of today's event. There's a lot of discussion about online teaching and remote teaching, and this notion that remote teaching is not online teaching. I think that that gets put forth a lot, perhaps as an excuse or sort of as a way to sort of justify sort of contemporary models of teaching as being equal to what occurred pre-pandemic. That's sort of my cynical take on it. But there is, in fact, a key difference that I see between online, as I understand it, and remote. Is that online refers to cyberspace. You know, people are creating a space. It's a real space. They might own that space, but it doesn't literally exist on land. It's somehow sort of out there. Whereas when I think about remote teaching, I'm basing it on the idea that I am in a physical place, specifically in Kuya and Tongva land, and so is everybody else, not necessarily in that particular land, but everybody is somewhere. So I think that it really lends itself to the notion of land-based pedagogy in a way perhaps that online doesn't quite as much, although definitely feel free to tell me otherwise. Because, of course, knowledge production is always situated in particular places and contexts, by definition, I think in indigenous pedagogies, there's no such thing as knowledge without knowers, as it sometimes describes sort of knowledge that's just sort of out there to be consumed. Storytelling and story work are huge notions in indigenous pedagogies. Storytelling, I think, as a concept stands alone, but I want to emphasize that it's a very rigorous process, not just sort of randomly saying things, but rather sort of telling stories in an intentional way, often following particular protocols. I also wanted to call everybody's attention to the notion of story work as a named concept in storytelling. I'm taking this from Joanne Archibald, from Stolo Scholars, Joanne Archibald's Indigenous Story Work, Educating the Heart, Mind, Body, and Spirit. Story work, as Archibald calls it, refers to experiential narratives that privilege a cultural lens, an indigenous cultural lens. And definitely not last but not least is the notion of holism. Focus in pedagogies on the whole person and how individuals are part of multiple communities, by extension, a focus then on wellness for all involved. With respect to academic knowledge, then, I think of academic knowledge as being important within a context that includes physical, emotional, spiritual, and other development, and where all of those things can never be separated from each other. And also by extension, then, is the notion that individuals and communities are always accountable to each other. I think about this a lot in terms of R words, words that start with R that are prominently featured in indigenous research models as well as in pedagogies. I want to share a few with you. Respect or reverence, those are very interrelated. Relevance, the notion that information should be made relevant, knowledge should be made relevant. In certain sorts of courses, that's self-evident how something is relevant. But I think what this teaches me is that in some cases where something might not seem immediately relevant, it's sort of appropriate for me to sort of make that link and to help others make that link or to explore it in a co-produced knowledge system. Hugely important is the notion of reciprocity. Also hugely important, then related to that, is the notion of responsibility. And anchoring all of these things is the bigger R word, relationality. The notion that everything is interrelated and by extension, interdependent. There are many lessons to take from this for courses, both whether they be remote or in some other modality. So I'll note that in the previous slide, I mentioned that knowledge is co-produced. Here we might instead say, extend that to say that knowledge is co-produced in relational contexts, emerging through and dependent on a multitude of relationships that include humans with other humans, but also humans with lands, spirits, non-human relatives, lands with spirits, and so on. By extension, it's crucial that each discretely named R concept must be considered in relation to the others. And for example, an obvious one is that responsibility to knowledge is anchored in respect for the producers of that knowledge. And in a classroom context or in a remote teaching context, I think that this also entails putting focus on the places and the context of that earlier knowledge production. I also in the previous slide mentioned Joanne Archibald's notion of story work. I don't think I mentioned though that story work has 7 principles, many of which are R words: respect, responsibility, reverence, reciprocity, holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. Synergy is the one that sort of gets added to what we've been talking about. I privileged my own tribal language earlier. I'm going to do it again here by sharing a verb root, awem. Notice I didn't fill in what it means. Well, some of you are familiar with this already. Let me give you a few examples where it actually shows up. Ewe Malane, I am your relative. And this, by the way, is definitely awem at the beginning, but the initial vowel changes in my Miamia as well as in other Algonquian languages in certain contexts. It's a grammatical phenomenon. Ewe Malane, I am your relative. Ewe Makeke, they are related to me or my relations. The root, if we add a reciprocal suffix, awende means to be related to or allied with each other. And then if we take that final one and we add a noun suffix, to make it into a noun, awende one means alliance or peace. This is very, very important, very, very revealing. The notion that by knowing relations and by fostering relationships, one is actually creating peace. One is actually creating wellness. I think it's a very profound lesson that applies across all of my pedagogies and that I hope will sort of be meaningful to all of you as well. I just wish that the United States leadership knew this, but we won't go into that right at the moment. So those are some themes of indigenous pedagogies. Well, how about sort of decolonial pedagogies? Well, they're heavily related to indigenous pedagogies, but I want to make some differentiation. Recognition that, among other things, I think that decolonial pedagogies apply across the board or should apply across the board. Indigenous pedagogies in terms of their R concepts, in terms of relationality, in terms of sort of key basic ideas, absolutely, likewise, I think apply across the board or can apply across the board. However, specific tribal pedagogies have a convention in the Western Academy of being exploited and perhaps being misused. Say something like a medicine wheel that's being used in some classroom by somebody who doesn't really have the appropriate background to do that. And so I do think that there is a difference then between sort of indigenous specific and then decolonial, although they are closely related. So decolonial pedagogies are anchored in the awareness of colonialism and the power structures in all of its areas. So historical and present, institutional, academic, ideological, and so on, especially with respect to how certain ways of knowing and being become dominant or hegemonic, to use the more academic term. That is to say, where they become so regular that people start to assume that they're normal. They don't have to be explained or they don't have to be questioned. But of course, they do need to be explained and they do need to be questioned. In many cases, they're quite harmful for indigenous peoples and others. The basic theme of decolonial pedagogies is that education can and should be emancipatory and promote social justice. Colonialism causes people to be shackled in various ways. Decolonial pedagogies can reverse that. Decolonial pedagogies heavily overlap with other types of critical pedagogies, such as Black pedagogies, feminist pedagogies, Black feminist pedagogies, and so on. And very, very often indigenous pedagogies as well, as I already said. One in particular I think is so core to decolonial pedagogies that I decided to just list it again, and that would be the notion of holism, the focus on the whole person and how individuals are part of multiple communities and how sort of having that particular focus then promotes wellness. I'll observe here that colonization or colonialism as an idea represents multiple layers of ruptures and removals. So communities get removed from land, people from communities, relations from intergenerational continuity, spirituality from everything. Or in the case of my particular academic work, indigenous languages get removed from the relational context in which they can thrive. They get changed into these sort of scientific objects made up of grammar and vocabulary. And there's often quite a bit of engineering involved to bring them back to their full community contexts. I think most people here, not all, but most people here are UCR affiliates. And I want to encourage you to really think about our own students at UCR and realize that some of you are students at UCR. I think decolonial pedagogies are especially important at a place like UCR because many of these layers of ruptures and removals have been experienced by our students, indigenous and non-indigenous. Also fundamental to the notion of decolonial pedagogies then is I think a differentiation made by Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai Smith, a differentiation that I find to be incredibly, incredibly useful. sharing information versus sharing knowledge. Sharing information, she observes, is surface information, pamphlet knowledge, encyclopedic knowledge, if you will. And she differentiates that from sharing knowledge, which she describes as a long-term commitment that entails sharing the theories and analyses which inform the way knowledge and information are constructed and presented. In my own work as a linguist, I see a lot of examples of sharing information. Usually it entails a non-Indigenous linguist doing work on, the term on being intentional, on an Indigenous language, doing some sort of a description, putting that into linguistic ease in a particular way, and then giving people a copy of that and saying, I'm being reciprocal, here's a copy of the thing, but it's not sort of embedded in the local ways of knowing. Sharing knowledge, I think, particularly if it's done collaboratively all along, would probably produce much better products, things that would be useful to multiple stakeholders, and would also then sort of entail quite a bit of discussion, ongoing discussion, about sort of why things are presented in a particular way or why they're viewed in a particular lens. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith and I think, share the idea that there's sort of no intrinsically wrong way, or very few very intrinsically wrong ways of sort of conceptualizing knowledge. But it's always appropriate to call attention to those ways, whatever they are, and then people are sort of better equipped to work through them. There's another R word that comes up, refusal. So the other ones were sort of, if you will, sort of positive things, but I did want to sort of capture this one as described in a chapter by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang called R Words, Refusing Research. What they're getting at here is the notion that certain types of knowledge that have been produced and certain types of knowledge and ways of sharing knowledge that are prominent in the academy can be quite harmful. In this particular essay, they're talking specifically and primarily about Indigenous communities, but the same concept applies across the board to communities that have been structurally marginalized. Knowledge can be exploited and it can be used against us. By extension, then, they note the following. Refusal understands the wisdom in a story, as well as the wisdom in not passing that story on. Refusal in research makes way for other R words for, and here are several, resistance, reclaiming, recovery, reciprocity, repatriation, regeneration. I was thinking about this in terms of my own teaching at UCR, and to an extent there's some sort of, maybe a sort of basic neo-colonial idea that anybody could technically refuse. And they said, well, you don't have to take the class, compulsory education ends in 9th grade or at the age of 16 or something like that, depending on the state. But that to me is akin to saying, well, if you're worried about infectious disease, then just don't leave your house, and sort of doing so in a way that doesn't capture that there might be structural limitations on somebody to exercise that type of choice. And so I think a lot about this in my own classes. Certainly I'm in favor of people sharing a lot of their background, articulating their positionalities, because those things are key to these other R concepts. But I tend to promote quite a bit of flexibility about doing that, because in some cases, there are contexts where somebody needs to refuse to do that and has a good reason for doing so. I see that as a pedagogical style then, in sort of adopting that type of flexibility up front, recognizing that there's sort of deeper power structures at play that need to be worked around until we get them fixed, which we're working on. And finally, I want to sort of share then a little decolonial tool that I use to point out whose knowledge is centered in academic fields. And I can tell you most of the time it's not Indigenous knowledge, but it can be changed. The point that I often make in reference to my own field is that linguistics is not the same as linguistics. The same point applies elsewhere. Anthropology is not the same as anthropology. History is not the same as history. Psychology is not the same as psychology, and so on. By capital L linguistics, I'm referring to the scope and conventions of investigation in the discipline represented by the Linguistic Society of America and by similar professional organizations. Drives me batty when my fellow linguist scholars will say something like, linguistics is the scientific study of language, and I say, no, linguistics as a named field is a particular brand of scientifically studying language, where language is also defined in particular ways that are largely centered in Eurocentric knowledge systems. That doesn't mean that they are wrong, but it absolutely does mean that they are limited and that they are not inherent. There's a whole lot of what we call sort of knowledge prescriptivism or epistemological prescriptivism in the academy, as well as gatekeeping to the effect that that's not anthropology, that's not history, that's not sociology, something like that. And I find it very, very useful to adopt this tool as a way to respond to that. So we might then say, well, lowercase l linguistics just refers to the study of language in its broadest possible sense, but without imposing any particular way of knowing onto that. What description might go here? Well, I'm not going to answer that question in the sake of time, or for the sake of time, but I do want to pose it to all of you and invite you to put in your own sort of disciplinary specializations with the uppercase and the lowercase to make that differentiation. And finally, as my last slide here, you can tell I'm in favor of R words. I think that they're very, very, very useful. So I wanted to share with you a possible R word model for UCR, which, as you know, adopts R in many, many places as a marketing tool, but also as a way, I think, of building community. This is a model that comes from a subcommittee of a current special committee in the Faculty Senate that's charged with revising the general education model for UCR, which has been in place since around 1981. I'm had the pleasure of chairing this subcommittee that came up with a proposal known as R-Search, which is a play on the term research, but also the notion of research as in knowledge production, but also researching, searching something through multiple lenses, and builds in the notion of R's. So perhaps this will be useful to those of you who are teaching, particularly if you're starting next week, as I am. In this particular model, the R-Search community is put at the center. That would be the UCR community that we all create in our classes. And anchoring it is a number of other R words, such as respect, reciprocity, relationality, responsibility, and reflexivity. Reflexivity is that critical awareness of oneself and always of how sort of one's particular background affects an outcome in any given situation. And so on that note, I think I've talked a little bit more than I had meant to. So I'm going to go ahead and invite, I think, Gerald to share some thoughts.
Thank you, Wesley. That was great. Can everyone hear me? Just give me a nod or, okay, great. Yeah, so I just want to say I've been teaching now for like 25 years, from the high school level all the way through regional university. Did I just lose her? Oh no, everybody still there?
Yeah, you're fading okay, a bit, but we'll do your...
Maybe, Wesley, maybe try me back and, oh, wait a minute, things are coming back. Can everybody hear me? Skip me for now, Wesley.
Gerald, maybe you could sort of sign out and sign back in, but you were having some issues earlier. So on that note, sort of Sami, would you like to speak now? And please tell us who you are, because not everybody knows you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sami. I'm a doctoral candidate with all but dissertation out of UC Santa Cruz Department of Anthropology. I have taught at UCR in the Native Studies program last year, and I really enjoyed myself. I love UCR students. It's a fantastic place. My son also goes to UCR. He's a critical economist in the making. So today I wanted to present to you some of my current thoughts in some of the work that I'm doing, and thinking about how the work that I'm doing translates into pedagogy. So let me get my presentation out. I don't have slides. I'm not really a slide person. Let's see, where did my file go?
while they're sort of finding the presentation, I'll note that I have mixed feelings about slides myself. There was, I thought, too much text, but then I decided, well, that's going to facilitate the situation, especially if my voice starts fading out, which can occur. And then it gave me something that I can share with everybody later. So there are pros and cons. If we were meeting in person, we would just have a nice meal together. That would be better. And someday we'll do that again.
Yeah. If you just give me a moment, I don't know what happened to my presentation window. I'm so sorry.
Maybe we could go back to Gerald, and see what's
Well, I'm back. Can everyone hear me now? So I'm talking to you from my home here on the Cahuilla Indian Reservation. So internet access is a little sketchy, if you know what I mean. I've taught for 25 years, and I taught an online class for the first time. The slides that Wesley put together, he really formulated some of the things that I just do. I just naturally do. I feel like I was hired to bring a kind of an outside perspective into the department. I am in the Ethnic Studies department. And so, right off the bat, I tell my students, I learn as much from them as they learn from me. There's always some comment that some student out of the blue will say, and I just like, wow, I've never considered that. So I'm really upfront that way. And I was, to be honest with you, I'm not tech savvy, so I didn't do like polls during class, and I didn't do a lot of breakout rooms because I was just afraid that I'd be crashing or, what have you. Luckily, I had a TA that was really knowledgeable and tech savvy, and so a lot of the breakout groups and a lot of the discussions happened in the discussion sections. And then to also, a lot of the assignments were discussion boards where I wanted the students, not just to hear from me, but the students learn so much when they hear each other's opinions. And so I made that a major element of the assignments that they did throughout the quarter. And one of the things is it was primarily like a lecture class, and I sit right here where I'm talking to you right now. But about week 3, I finished a lecture about 10 minutes early. And to my surprise, about 40% of the students, they just stayed on. And then they started unmuting themselves and they started asking questions. Sometimes it was related to the subject, sometimes it wasn't. But a lot of really interesting things happened. It was learning. I was learning, they were learning, we were having these discussions. So, I just happened on that by accident. But, I want to also point out one problem, and I don't want to focus on these, specific student, but sometimes like STEM students, right? They're used to coursework and pedagogies which are surround this or focus on this memorization of information. Then you take the test, then you forget it, right? And when I come with this other approach in my class, to be quite honest with you, some of those students just blow me off. They think, oh, this is an easy class. I don't have to memorize this or that. And that's a problem, I think. And it's because they disvalue storytelling, right? What Wesley was saying earlier. And I do my best to point out, I'll show documentaries where some elder tells a story and there's knowledge in that story. And then immediately they have a PhD say the same damn thing. And then everyone's like nodding their heads and such. And so it's about teaching them critical thinking, to recognize when those kinds of things happen in the classroom. And I'm here to learn too, and I'm really interested to hear all your approaches to this as we go through the year and talk about these important subjects. Thank you.
Me with Gerald, my wonderful sort of colleague in ethnic studies. And so, Sami, are we able to get situated?
Okay, thank you. And we're back. Okay, so I didn't really quite finish my introduction. I'm calling in from occupied Cahuilla territory in so-called Joshua Tree. My research primarily thinks with native bees, and as they are studied and observed through Euro-American science and technologies that are specific to agriculture. But there's a lot of aspects of that that would take too much time to discuss. So let me get to the presentation. Currently, I'm thinking about practices of decolonial care that confront academic negligence of native beings, tangible and intangible. So moving into a space of decolonial care in the academy is to reimagine and recreate academic practices that emerge out of one's relationalities and contextual indigenous protocols. So today here I'm thinking, or attempting to, thinking about how to co-imagine with you all in this session of what pedagogies of care could be and what they could become. All things are in motion. So thinking far into the future will guide folks now to start at a place that transcends status quo pedagogies. So one point I'd like to make here is that there is a need, as Wesley pointed out, for both decolonial and anti-colonial pedagogies of care in the academy. But I also question what that term care is when situated in an institution where, generally speaking, the baseline of care is extremely low. I also like to point out that, I'd like to also point out that anti-colonial inquiries in pedagogy is highly important, just as decolonial. And the reason being is that unsettling settler colonial logics, not only in but beyond the academy, requires collective efforts with all beings and peoples and from all origins. So an anti-colonial framework for pedagogy is critically important. So now let me go into anti-colonial pedagogy and then examples of decolonial pedagogies. So anti-colonial. Anti-colonial care in labs and classrooms may include seemingly quotidian practices, but within the institution, these finer details are actually radical. An Indigenous Métis colleague and friend of mine whose lab and teaching spaces begin at anti-colonial pedagogies. While they are an Indigenous scholar, when their class or student lab researchers are primarily composed of non-Indigenous students, they recalibrate their pedagogies through anti-colonial practices. For example, prior to opening the lab, so they obtain funding to start a new lab. So prior to opening that lab and at the outset of the quarter, they and their students together co-write anti-colonial acts of care as protocol. So one protocol that their lab has agreed on, at least last year, is that when any student is sick, heartbroken, tired, hungry, stressed, anxious, depressed, or sad, they are not to attend class or show up to the lab. In addition, if any of these symptoms rise to the surface during class or while working in the lab, they are also asked to leave the session so as to take care of themselves. So these co-written protocols are not class rules, rather they are mutually agreed upon protocols that students and their faculty agree and commit to. So from that example, I pose a question to y'all in this discussion as to what anti-colonial pedagogies of care do you imagine? And how do you imagine that emerging and being enacted while teaching in digital spaces? Okay, so now I'm going to discuss some examples of decolonial care. And the first one I'd like to mention continues on with my Métis friend in Northern Canada, which is they study fish and ocean pollution, and they are an Indigenous, they study fish, and I'm getting to I'm trying to reveal the end before I get to it, so let me slow down. So they hold an Indigenous student-led ceremony together when they repatriate fish guts to the ocean. So in their studies of fish, they're looking for pollution that impacts fish populations. And to do so, they need to remove the guts out of the fish. And so my Métis friend has a protocol that is mutually agreed upon, where an Indigenous student of the lab or of the class leads ceremony with their fellow students while the fish guts are repatriated to the ocean. Another example is Dr. Kim Tallbear's lab out of the Native Studies Department at the University of Alberta. I'm a researcher in both of her labs, Indigenous Studies of Science, Technology, Society, and Environment, or ISTS is our acronym. I'm also a researcher for her second lab, which is RELAB. So thank you, Wesley, for the R's, because it feeds right in really well, seamlessly to this part of my presentation. So RELAB, RE-lab, is an inter and multidisciplinary effort. The three conceptual pillars of RELAB are Restory, Research, and Reclaim. And those three pillars anchor our research creation, discourse, and practices. So our lab essentially thinks about research creation, where research is coupled with creative works. And we're very interested in thinking in those spaces, since really that's an Indigenous space and an Indigenous way of thinking, right? These are words. So our words are Restory, Research, and Reclaim. So let me describe what we mean by these things and as it pertains to RELAB and our efforts through the lab. So we aim to restore the colonial terrain, challenging civilizing and hierarchical settler narratives and futures with Indigenous narratives of good relations between and among human and more than human bodies, and critical accounts of settler colonial damage to those relations. Restoring is also understood as an imperative for imagining, creating, living, and reclaiming multiple ways of relating across worlds. The second pillar that we activate in the lab is research. So RELAB projects foreground Indigenous standpoints, theories, and self-determination that blend ethnographic, archival, and artistic research practices. So the engagement process is as important as the research creative final work, final in quotes. RELAB provides our members virtual and actual spaces to ground creative research practice in order to generate and share Indigenous kin making and relational concepts. And finally, the third pillar of our projects are to simultaneously with research and restory is to reclaim Indigenous sexual and environmental relations as good relations. Human bodies and more than human bodies, including lands, waters, astral, and atmospheric bodies. RELAB is a research creation incubator aimed at producing works that contribute to better human and planetary relations rooted in creative practice. That, by the way, is straight from our co-agreed upon description of our lab. And I'm happy to share the website with y'all or give it to Wesley. Okay, so in the lab, we're developing programs that engage researchers whose work interfaces with creative work and research, such as weaving and beadwork, for example. And within Indigenous communities and Indigenous scholarly communities, we know very well that weaving and beadwork requires research. So in this initiative, we're thinking about how we might also best care for and uplift Black, Indigenous, and folks of color who are research creatives and who are already critical community creatives. So in this process of thinking about research creation and as a decolonial practice, we also want to make sure that we honor our community thinkers, and we honor our community knowledge keepers, and we honor those who are already practicing creative works along with their research from an Indigenous standpoint. Out of our work, our programs that we're currently developing in Relab that I have pulled from for this conversation are two relevant points for me that are relevant to this conversation. The first one is reimagining, and the second one is co-learning. So with that, I'll move into the, I think that's the end of my presentation. And I pose to you here, what decolonial pedagogies of care do you imagine as distinct from anti-colonial, and how do you imagine them to be while teaching in digital spaces? I do have one finer point that's actually not written here in my presentation, which is that this past summer, I taught, I can't remember how many I've taught, but I taught another online class this past summer for UC Santa Cruz anthropology department. And y'all, we've all been through fires here, right? Lots of fires, and our students during remote teaching are spread out in lots of places, especially given current situations that we are all facing, pandemics of all sorts. And what I learned this summer really solidified a practice of care that, in truth, when I practiced this pedagogy prior to this summer, I didn't think of it per se as entirely impactful. It was truly out of a sense of care for students, and that is to be flexible. And it sounds counterintuitive, but to be really flexible for students given the extreme circumstances that people face. And we all know that Black, Indigenous, and people of color face multiple pandemics there throughout life. And so in understanding that and knowing that Indigenous folks and Black folks and folks of color experience multiple pandemics at the same time, made me think, how can this, the context of teaching online during a summer of quarantine push me further in practices of pedagogies of care in remote learning? What resulted this summer out of the online course that I taught for the anthropology department was really not what folks would imagine pedagogy of care to be, but in this case it was, and that was, we actually canceled the rest of the class once the fire started. So in that emergency, we allowed students to submit whatever work they had. They got the grade that they already had in their assignments. And, you know, in that sense, that was a radical act of care in the academy, is to actually care about students' circumstances and understand that completing certain tasks of a remote learning class may not be that particularly important over staying safe in fires and COVID and all of these multiple pandemics that are occurring at the same time. So it pushed me to think about how I might do better at being flexible with students and caring for them in those ways so that they have the space to care for themselves. I've yet to process what I've learned from this summer, but those are some of the immediate thoughts that I have. In conclusion, I thank Wesley for the invitation to this presentation, and I very much look forward to co-creating decolonial and anti-colonial pedagogies of care with y'all today. So thank you.
Mishinewe, big thanks, Sami. And so there could be sort of questions, but I'm going to encourage people to post questions in the chat, recognizing that we won't necessarily get to all of them, but we can try. At this point, I'd like to sort of open the floor, particularly to sort of folks who are teaching at UCR, to share sort of specific tips, specific things that you have done to adopt sort of indigenous and decolonial pedagogies in a context of remote teaching. There is that sort of raise hand function. If you sort of raise your hand, or if you just, I think I can see everybody at this point, if somebody just raises their hand, then I could call on you. But don't all jump at once. Right, so there's specific examples of sort of indigenous and decolonial pedagogical strategies people have employed or intend to employ sort of in UCR remote teaching. But Kim, I see your hand raised. I'd love for you to speak.
Yeah, so I think before Sami spoke today, I wouldn't know that I would characterize it as decolonial or anti-colonial, but I centered a lot of my teaching since the pandemic started on an ethics of care. And like just every choice I made was rooted in ethics of care. And that what's interesting about that is it was really freeing for me if that was the center of how I was making decisions, somehow it really took away like the institutionalization of higher education. Like and I felt like it really did promote learning. So for example, particularly with all of the, the kind of intersection of crises at the end of spring quarter, where students were, calling for action, in particular for us to, make finals optional, different things to recognize the challenges that students were having at the time. If you were coming from an ethics of care, those were not difficult decisions to make. And so, and also just thinking of, flexibility, again, like Sami was saying, flexibility about, when students turn things in. I did try, though, to provide structure so that, because I know that an ethics of care also respected that some students needed the scaffolding of, you don't have to do everything exactly when I'm doing these things, but here are some deadlines to help you space things out. So instead of having, exams, I had weekly quizzes. And I saved time in class for them to do it instead of expecting them to add more time outside of class, right? Just like if we were in person, we would hand out exams in class and they would take them in class and we would be there to answer their questions. I did the same thing on Zoom. I would release the quiz and then I would be there just sitting for the 20 minutes I expected them to take the quiz. And for those students who had other demands on their time during that 20 minutes, and maybe they weren't in the lecture when the quiz was given out, they still had, until, Saturday midday to turn it in. And I would have my office hours, because I don't have to physically go to my office hours were 9 to 11 p.m. on a Friday night, which, many people weren't working. And so they actually showed up to office hours and asked questions. And so if they started the quiz, but they had a question, they could come to office hours and ask me a question before the quiz was due. So anyways, that's just one example of like trying to think, what is a way, and students remarked on this. They said the teacher, the instructor, the professor, she cared so much about us as people that, I really wanted to try my best. I couldn't do everything I wanted to do, but I really wanted to try my best because I felt like she actually cared about us. I think it facilitates learning.
Thank you so much for sort of sharing that. The last sentence, let's sort of work with that a bit. It facilitates learning. Isn't that just sort of indigenous and decolonial pedagogies facilitate learning? They're not hurting anything. They are helping. They are doing better But what they can do sometimes is to disrupt colonial hierarchies and power structures that people are very, very invested in, sometimes even in ways that they're not consciously aware of. Indeed, so I think it's, now this current context might be an opportunity to really sort of imagine sort of radically different structures. I felt like what happened a lot in the spring quarter, although I wasn't teaching myself, was that there was an assumption of a certain norm, and then people were trying to recreate that particular norm as much as they could, but then some people with a whole lot of flexibility. Like, for example, the notion of an exam. People say, I'm worried about my students cheating, and so we're going to have to proctor and stuff, and there are ways to do that in remote contexts. But I wonder then is, under sort of what type of relational knowledge and what sorts of sort of contexts might that issue not come up in the first place? And would that be a better way of addressing? And so, Yvonne, I saw that you posted a chat. Would you be able to say something about this?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't want to take space, but you threw me to the spotlight. Thank you for everyone. I was just sharing how usually I teach an intro to literary and cultural analysis class I taught it 3 or 4 times. When I got it, it's one of these classes that's very, it's about learning how to read, and it doesn't matter what you read exactly. So I revamped the syllabus and we read mostly women. And then that is one strategy that I have found, just course content without being explicit about it impacts a lot with students. This class, usually in class, I do a lot of like group activities and group discussions, and I walk around and I really lecture less than half of the class. But now on Zoom, I'm very uncomfortable doing that because of accessibility. So another way of going about that was I thought about doing watch parties and assigning to the students a media journal where they write their responses to a certain media. I give them a list of options of a lot of animation, but not just animation, but a lot of animation that sort of imagines different worlds or tries to create different worlds. And I push them to do things collectively, watch the media collectively or together in a group, respond in a group, and that way something. Another thing that I did was that aside from midterms, aside from the midterm, all the other things, aside from midterm and one activity, all of the activities are collective upon option. That is, if they want to work together, they can work together. And I'm thinking of this as a way of opening up spaces for them to connect with each other outside of the classroom, sort of mimicking concepts in the university. And I hope that's doing. I mean, I'm reading Jessica's, and I also do a no-fail policy. We'll figure something out. And that's what I'm doing. Another idea that I had was a collective notebook of having an open Google Docs for everyone to add notes there without necessarily it being graded upon their content, but simply their participation, and just sort of working together.
And to sort of add to that, I saw in the chat there was a question to me about co-production of knowledge and sort of what that means. And I feel like it just gave a great example of that. So rather than sort of having this knowledge as an item out there that we, the students, then have to master and then reproduce, say, in an exam, have everybody contribute to it and recognize that people come from different backgrounds and that that's good because they're going to notice different things. But then they're all relationally accountable to each other in a way that I've found is very, very useful in classroom context, and I guess I'll try it in a remote context soon, in that when students are connected to each other, when they're already supporting each other, when they're already friends.
Yes, baby.
Oh, what was that? Positive feedback. Those things are, what's it called? And there's also sort of a second part of the question to me about sort of a question to me about explain the notion of sort of a knowledge being owned or ownership. I think in many contexts, the notion of ownership isn't maybe quite the right thing, but there is very much a notion of indigenous intellectual property and indigenous data sovereignty. Very much the idea that information or knowledge has been exploited, taken from indigenous communities, and then used for all sorts of problematic purposes. And there are some very, very egregious examples of this, say with DNA, for example, being taken. But then there are also, like, sort of more general notions, the basic notion of ethnography, the basic notion of linguistics, taking something, reproducing it, giving it sort of credentialed status in the academy. And then by extension, that starts to then get used to teach in ways that sort of reproduce whatever sort of power structures were embedded into it. Yes, indigenous data sovereignty is a growing movement. It recognizes that data, particularly sort of quantitative data, but other types of data, sort of as a matter of international law, belong to the communities that they come from, including indigenous communities who within this framework are framed as nationhood. It's a pretty complex topic, so I'll sort of leave it that, but very much sort of differently aligned from the contemporary academic norm where knowledge is believed to be universal. Something that's sort of put into the academy and then published upon and then shared. In many cases, those are good things to do, but often sort of occurring without the appropriate permissions. And so, Steph, I believe you are next. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Yeah, I really love hearing about the importance of storytelling and the pedagogies of care. These are things that, like, kind of like Gerald said, you just do naturally. This summer was the first time. I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology at UCR, and I've mostly TA'd, but this summer was my first time being an associate instructor, and I was teaching Introduction to Archaeology. And I wanted to do it in a different way because just the way that I've seen Introduction to Archaeology taught has always kind of glossed over the colonial and imperial history of archaeology. It's like one chapter in a book, and it's not kind of threaded through every aspect of teaching it, right? And so that was one kind of approach that I took, and that meant that I was introducing every week Indigenous voices, not necessarily scholars, but from all across the world in different contexts, and showing how archaeology is used as a way to continue to occupy space and continue to be a tool for colonization, and also bringing in the importance of, like, this disjuncture between past and present that kind of history had, the way that the academy really wants to do is, like, see the past as separate from the present, and that so that's kind of one of the focuses is that I wanted to show, is that, like, history is in the land, history is everywhere, and also talking about, like, I guess, yeah, so that was one thing, was just, like, trying to change the way that every topic was taught. Along with flexibility, I might get in trouble for saying this, but I just think everybody should get an A. I mean, I think that, like, why create a barrier to people's opportunities? And so, like, I kind of go into it in that respect of, like, the importance is just, like, that you create a community, you challenge your perspectives, you learn something that you can take beyond the classroom, and yeah, like, I want everybody to succeed. That's my primary intention, and that's what I tell everyone, like, whatever it is that I can do to help you succeed, and find meaning in this course for you, that's what I want you to take away. And so there are just two more things that I want to add. One of the things was that in terms of like co-production of knowledge, I would have discussion groups each week online, and I presented a debate question each week, and they had to pick a side and use all the different works, right? Whether it be like scientific knowledge, indigenous knowledge, indigenous scientific knowledge, and like choose a side, and then kind of recognize the benefits and the limitations of each. And the students loved it, and they did such a good job, like exactly giving them the space to kind of speak together and yeah, co-produce their knowledge. And then one of the things that I also wanted them to take away is like the importance of not looking at indigenous remains, like skeletal remains, as data, but as bodies and humans. And so that I think was really impactful for people to think about and like just relate with. Yeah, so I just think everybody should have a good experience and succeed, and that's my goal.
And Steph, I'm going to assume, I think you've sort of basically answered this question already, that when you work with that assumption and you set up the associated structures, the students do succeed.
Yeah, always. They always succeed because they know that you're creating the space for them to do that. You're not trying to punish them or force them to fit within a structure and be someone, fit a mold. Just giving them like all the tools and care that they need to be the best version of themselves, and take away something from the classroom. One thing, this is just a practical tip that I did this summer for the first time that I think a lot of the students benefited from, was I copied the text of every reading and put it in there's like calculators online that calculate the amount of time it should take to read the number of words. And so I would give students like, okay, yeah, maybe this is 30 pages or 10 pages or 15 pages, but it should take anywhere between like an hour and 15 minutes, or like an average would be like an hour and 15 minutes to read this assignment. And then reminding them though that like it could take them longer or it could take them less time, and none of that is a representation of their inherent worth. But it's just a way to kind of give them a way to plan and manage, because sometimes you just like see, oh, I have to read this and that and this and that, but like it's really hard for people, especially students, to time manage. And I mean, even for me, let's be honest. So I thought that was a really practical, useful tool that I would recommend, giving people an idea of how long they should expect to take for each thing. Thank you for giving me the space to share.
Ms. Shinewa, thank you. So I did want to leave sort of about 10 minutes at the end for us to discuss programming ideas. Maybe we can hear sort of one other sort of example. Asami, would you like to say something more? I see your hand up.
I would love to respond to the comments made this far, if y'all are okay with that. First, I'd like to respond to Kim. Kim, thank you for bringing up ethics of care that you've practiced this summer. And yeah, sometimes it is difficult when we are actually practicing care, because it's so sincere, we don't even recognize that that's what we're doing. And that's what I love about using a framework where we understand, okay, these are anti-colonial ways of practice. And so accomplices of Native and Indigenous folks can do the work with us through that anti-colonial framework. But one thing that I thought of when you were talking or speaking, sharing your comment is that a student said they saw me as a person. And that is a powerful statement. And in fact, I'll give you my own personal story in a very short snippet. When I first started my doctoral program, I applied to work with a specific person, just as you're advised to do, right? Someone who matches your research. Well, when I got into the program, it didn't match. We were not a good fit. There was not any acts of mutual care, and I felt as though I was not being seen as a person. So unlike my colleagues who chose to follow, existing academic practice where you work with someone who's directly matches your work, and they also, a lot of folks tend to also gravitate towards faculty with greater social capital. But myself, I actually took a stand to care for myself, and I decided to work with a chair who did see me as a person, and that's actually how I've described how our relationship developed. We saw each other as persons, we practiced mutual care, and through that, we developed a relationship that has blossomed into a beautiful, supportive relationship of each other. Next, I'd like to speak on the learning process. So I think about co-learning and collaboration as very distinct. While collaboration centers production. So I don't care for that term collaboration. It's also been not devalued, but it's been so widely disseminated that the term collaboration loses its meaning, or its meaning is diminished. But at the same, for me anyhow, collaboration centers production. Whereas I think about and write about in my upcoming article on care in the academy is co-learning. I prefer co-learning. And the reason for that is co-learning is an experiential process where knowledge is acquired through the experience, the study, by being or sharing sharing with others what you've been taught and teaching them, which is very different, right, than collaboration, especially as it pertains to the classroom. And then finally, Wesley, I want to respond to your point about data sovereignty. Data sovereignty is a growing movement, and I just wanted to share this this point of reference to y'all on the call. And that is, if y'all don't already know her, there is a wonderful scholar and friend, Anita Lucheski. She is the founder and executive director of Institute of Sovereign Bodies. And she is a scholar who initiated and protects data, where she has created a database of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks. The federal government has come to her many, many times, almost demanding access to the database, and she refuses and continues to refuse, and their institution stands by this as an act of sovereignty. And I'm happy to share the link to her institute as well. Thank you.
Yes. Anyway, Sama, and please, put the link into the chat. And I do want to, at this point in our last 7-8 minutes or so, sort of open the floor to sort of ideas for programming, sort of what might the Faculty Commons group sort of sponsor that will be of use and of interest to you on this general topic of sort of Indigenous and decolonial pedagogies, workshops, webinars, guest speakers. Let's just open the floor, and while people are raising their hands, Sami, I'll also mention with respect to collaboration, it's a big keyword in my field of linguistics, so much so that my colleague Erin Haynes and I wrote an article called Making Collaboration Collaborative, because it's so overused. So Tanya, I'd love to hear from you next.
Yeah, I thank you to all who shared their ideas and thoughts. one thing I would like to know more about is in particular the relationship with technology, right? So, because I feel like so much of what we talked about today, which, you know, I found really helpful is kind of alternatives to, you know, exist other pedagogies. But we didn't touch too much on the technology itself and how people respond to it, and how it may be different for different people. So that would be of interest to me. What are Indigenous understandings of technology and its role? Is there resistance for some reason because of historical misuse of technology and those kinds of things? That is it. Thank you.
All very important questions. I sort of really wondered how it was going to pan out, you know, during the pandemic, particularly when people are saying our language is meant to be used in person, and now, of course, they're, you know, going over Zoom. My tribal language camp this summer happened over Zoom. Interesting thing. One specific issue there, sort of Tanya and others, to think about sort of land-based pedagogies and how can you do sort of land-based pedagogies when you're all sort of in different lands. I think Michelle had to sort of sign off, Michelle Raheja. She's done some really great things. I think by having sort of people collect items wherever they happen to be, sort of relate to those particular lands and then to share that. And I always try to kind of remember where I come from by keeping this vial of dirt next to me. This is some dirt that's collected in the original and then the 2 removal places of the Miami people from Indiana, Kansas, and Oklahoma. So I can't physically, I suppose I could, but it would be hard to physically travel to those places now. But I can center myself through these sorts of things. And there are things that we can do, I think, online in similar ways. And I also sort of emphasize that earlier point about remote versus online. You know, and sometimes they mean the same thing, but remote implies that people are physically in a given place. And you can really draw from that. The other ideas for programming, of course, I'll sort of create some sort of mechanism for people to give comments, written comments later, but are there, you know, things you would like to see happen this year? And here it says, you know, specifics about sort of technology and its intersection with indigeneity. So please raise your hand or also feel free to make comments in the chat box. Nobody? I'm not used to having 3 minutes left. It never happens.
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, Wesley, I didn't quite catch it.
Interested in sort of hearing people's ideas and needs, interests with respect to programs that might occur sponsored by the Reclamation Native American Communities Faculty Commons Group. This could be things like sort of, you know, guest speakers. There are some amazing sort of Indigenous educators, for example, whom we could invite. I was thinking it'd be interesting to have a panel of graduate students, Native graduate students, sort of talking about sort of Indigenous pedagogies in their own classes, both in terms of what they do, but then perhaps also in terms of what they experience. I think that would be quite interesting to hear from people sort of, you know, in their various classes across the board, what kinds of issues are coming up. Are Indigenous and decolonial pedagogies being employed? And if not, what are the, or whether yes or no, what are the implications of that? I'm sort of seeing some things coming into the chat here. Anybody else?
Yes, I mean, I was going to suggest, or I was going to ask about what you just said, Wesley. I'm very interested in hearing about what other colleagues, grad students included, are doing in the classroom and how we can learn and we can share from each other, we can learn from each other, and we can do more things together. So I would very much like this space or more spaces to be created where we can share how we are responding.
Okay, others. Sami again, you're muted.
I have a question. Can we learn what you mean by programs?
I mean program with a lowercase p. To mean anything and everything that can be organized, in a remote fashion, and I do have some funding, for things like reciprocity to guest speakers, things to draw upon. Yeah, but programs could be sort of actual, sort of organized, formally organized events that would be advertised, across, say, to the UCR community and beyond. Guest speakers would normally be something like that. There can also be sort of smaller groups, just for informal gatherings. Yeah, but something that sort of takes, at this point, everything takes a bit of intentionality, because we don't just sort of, happen to pass by each other on campus the way that we otherwise would. So I think there does need to be some planning and sort of some intentionality, even for things that are relatively simple. Okay. Well, everyone, it's 3:59, so I think we can consider, continue this discussion over email. But I wanted to, just express my appreciation to you all for sort of joining us this afternoon at a particularly busy time of the, well, not of the quarter, but of the pre-quarter, I suppose. And maybe sort of as we're signing out, I'll just sort of offer people the opportunity to make final comments or sort of closing statements in the chat box, or if you'd prefer, just go ahead and unmute yourself, and then we'll sort of close from there. Okay. So again, Mishinewa, and
thank you so much.
Lim Lim.
Thank you so much. This was great. Really found the conversation about knowledge and sort of ownership so important, and just, something I do, as you know, all the time by, accident and not thinking through. And then sort of, I think one of the things is the stakes of all this, that sometimes it's easy to step aside and not think about, but I think the stakes can be really high. And also, like you said, these pedagogies help students learn. I mean, they don't hurt anyone. On the contrary, they help. And I think that point is the one that I've, have to make all the time to my meat and potato colleagues of historians who are like, well, this is not for me, but it's like how much they can help, how much they open doors for students. I think the stakes of that, beyond sort of the intellectual stakes, but like the pedagogical stakes, the construction. So anyway, I'm looking forward to anything and everything you are going to throw our way.
I'm glad you were able to make it, Alejandra.
Does anyone else want to speak? I'm happy to share some thoughts for those of y'all. Or Wesley, you and I can talk.
Our organizers also want to be mindful of their time, but are there sort of any final ones from anybody?
Thank you, Wesley, and everyone else who shared. Thank you. Very excited to be working with y'all, actually. Hi, Freyels. It was great seeing you.
Okay, be well, everybody.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you as well. This was really great. It just kind of helps. It's inspiring to see people, interested in promoting the well-being of, students, land, and people in general. So I'm just grateful that you're putting this together and look forward to the next thing. And nice to see you all.
It's great to see you, Freya.
Thank you.
And then,
can I just say, Wesley, I would love to hear more about like bringing humor into the classroom. I think that would be, I love that part about like that being a pedagogy. So that's something that I would like to learn.
Oh, that would be such a fun discussion, The examples would be great, Like to say, I disrupt hegemony by well, arriving to the room. And it's like, you know, it's like, I'm supposed to be extinct. It's like, this is, yeah.
That's a good one, Wesley.
Steph, actually, I'd like to add to your comment. It was one that I have written here, which is programming that brings up joy, something that's fun and engaged, because, you know, many people may not realize that Native folks are jokesters and we love having fun. So doing that through as a learning practice, an experiential learning or co-learning in a fun space, that would be exciting. So Steph, do you have any in mind?
That's so hard. I don't know. I haven't reflected on it. I mean, I guess in the same sense of thinking about like co-production, you know, like, and like building community, like centering community. I always think like, you know, kind of how you were saying, like, let's create protocols together of care. Like, similarly, like, let's all talk about what brings us joy and what we find humorous, and, like, in some ways, like, letting people, like, bring their humor into the community. And then just, like, in some ways, like, I always try and work with something that I feel like is organic, like, allows itself to become whatever it needs to be. So I guess that's my immediate thought, is because, like, I don't want to, like, kind of like what Wesley said, like, I don't ever want to kind of impose my ideas on the class as, like, this is the best way to have joy and laugh. But, like, yeah, just, like, hear from everybody. So, well, I don't know. What do you think?
I love that. You know, I haven't thought about how to have a programming of joy, except I do try and bring it into the classroom on a regular basis. And I think one of our comments said that, you know, these are things that we practice by accident. So the important thing for me is to think how to be critically conscious of having ethics of care, and through joy, you know, something humorous, but that's relative to the learning. But one thing I want to point out, which your comment made me think or remember, is that I have a colleague who co-creates their syllabus with the students. So the students decide on which assignments they want to do, they decide on which readings they will do, and they decide on which assignments they will do. And, you know, they're all of the choices are equally weighted. So it's up to them to choose what they would like. That whole syllabus of outline, not just one session. So I find that to be quite a great example of co-learning. And that's actually a fun activity if you think about it. Like sitting there, looking at syllabus, talking with your friends, figuring out what you want to learn. That's fun.
Well, Sami, I would say I'm in agreement, but I tried that this summer with my intro class and it completely backfired. Students actually told me that they were angry at me for trying to be flexible and, you know, non-authoritative. They're like, we know you're trying to be nice, but you're just making us angry. And so they told me that they resented my lack of structure. They told me that, and so in the sense that Kim was saying that some, particularly I think intro students, need some form of security to play, right? I think with advanced students, they're more willing because they know what they want and they know what works for them. Whereas intro students are just trying to pass a class, right? And so they want the teacher to tell them, you know, I want 500 words by week 2. I want 100 words on week 3. And so my students basically told me in the intro class, all of your flexibility does nothing but make us crazy and angry at you. So there has to be a little bit of balancing in terms of how you pitch it, and I think when and you know, the kind of format. So
there's definitely a lot of discussion to have. I do want to sort of, again, be mindful of our time, and so let's continue this discussion. Again, thank you all so much for being here.
Yeah.
And have a good rest of the day.
Yes.